Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to The History Effect, an online series produced by the History Council of New South Wales. I'm Nancy Cushing of the University of Newcastle and Vice President of the History Council, and I'm hosting this week's sessions on the 1918 to 19 pneumonic flu pandemic, or Spanish flu. Tonight's talk is by Laila Ellmoos, who will address us on remembering the Spanish flu in Sydney, oral history and memory. And we've had a few sneak peeks of the oral histories, and I can't wait to hear more of them and what Laila has to say about them. But first I want to acknowledge the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which the History Council's offices stand, and also their elders past, present and future. And so I think you saw the instructions coming in that please remain muted just to avoid any extraneous background noise. But if you do have comments or questions, put them in the chat and I'll convey as many questions as I can to Laila at the end of the time we have together. She'll be speaking for about 20 minutes and we'll try to have 10 minutes for questions. So I'd now like to introduce Laila Ellmoos. She's a professional historian who works at the City of Sydney, where she's involved in developing history content for exhibitions, talks and publications. She's a member and past president of the Professional Historians Association of New South Wales and ACT, and the author of 3 books. So tonight, as I mentioned, Laila is drawing on the oral history collections held by the City of Sydney, and she's going to share with us some stories of the Spanish flu and talk about memory as a concept around those stories, how people remembered the flu. I'm really looking forward to hearing more of these voices of people who, like us, lived through a pandemic and survived to remember and reflect on their experience. So a warm welcome, Laila.
Thanks so much, Nancy. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that I'm living and I'm currently working here on Mongol country. So tonight I'm going to play you some excerpts from some oral history interviews that are held in the City of Sydney's history collections. And I'm going to feature 6 people who were talking about the Spanish flu in 1919. I'm just going to share my screen with you all. So these people lived in Sydney's inner city suburbs, including Millers Point, Woolloomooloo, Newtown and Erskineville. The City of Sydney's oral history collection actually contains 500 recorded interviews. Historians at the city have been generating oral history since the 1980s, and the earliest interviews that we have in our collection date from 1982, and we still have an active program of collecting. So the first interview that I'm going to play for you, so just to explain how this talk's going to work, I'm actually going to play you some excerpts of oral history interviews. I'll just give a brief introduction about the person, and then you'll be able to hear their, wonderful Australian voices. So the first person that I'm going to play an excerpt of the interview from is a woman called Alice Brown, and the interview was conducted in 2006 by Frank Hyman, and this was part of a project by the New South Wales Department of Housing with residents of Millers Point. Alice grew up in Millers Point and she talks about her mother who died from the flu.
My mother was born in Tasmania. Her dad was a seaman and he was born in Kent Street, Millers Point. I think he was at sea when Mum caught the flu in 1919. And she was only sick a couple of days, and she was taken to the temporary hospital in the Deaf and Dumb Institute in City Road, where she died. She left 3 of us. I had 2 brothers. George was the eldest. He was 4 and a half, and Eddie was 3 and a half, or almost that, and then myself, I was a year and 11 months. My grandmother took us down to Kent Street, Millers Point, to 84 Kent Street, where I lived until I was 29. But Mum wouldn't stay at home. My grandmother wanted her to stay at home and she would nurse her because Gran had been nursing some of the neighbours as well. Ruby Callback next door to my grandmother in Kent Street. She had just got over the flu, and she said to my mother, "Are you frightened?" And she says, "Yes." And my grandmother reckoned she frightened herself into it, but she wouldn't stay home. She thought she'd get better at hospital. Gran said it was very bad weather, and of course in those days I believe the ambulance were not like now. They were only canvas and that, and they took her to several hospitals, a couple of hospitals, Canterbury and somewhere else, but they couldn't get in, and she was within 6 weeks of a confinement.
So the next person we'll hear is Woolloomooloo local Billy Pascoe. And he talks about the impact of the flu in the suburb of Woolloomooloo where he lived and the methods of prevention, some of them unusual, including a homemade remedy of vinegar and brown paper.
Straight after that we got the flu, and I think everyone in Woolloomooloo had the flu. All schools were stopped, academic stopped. If you walked outside, you had to have a mask on, and there was no cure. All you done was go to bed, and anyone that was up, the only cure there was, I used to have vinegar and brown paper. That was the only. There was no Aspros them days, nothing like that. Never heard of headache powder or Aspros. That was unheard of in 1920. So all you done, you went to bed and you stayed there for 4 or 5 days. They were dying like flies. They had trams run up Oxford with a great big red cross on them. They take, the hospitals were all full, and they took them out the showground, put them where the horses and cattle, all that was. That's where they all finished up. Well, we just hadn't been over that 6 months, then the bubonic plague come. That was, with all the rats. That war come back through the war too. Next to the flu come. There was more killed with the flu than was killed in the war. They were killed in hundreds and thousands. Every street you say, poor old so-and-so's gone. Oh, so 2 gone in the one house. They died like flies. And they were cured for it. It was no good. Well, that's the only thing there was. To keep the fever down, they give you vinegar and brown paper. I don't know why the brown paper come in it.
But what did they do with it, this brown paper?
Supposed to get the fever down.
But they put it on your chest?
No, on your forehead.
What, brown paper soaked in vinegar?
Soaked in vinegar, put on your forehead. And you laid in bed then and we died for about 10 days, I think it was, before you got over it.
Did you get it?
Everyone got it. Everyone in the house had it. I think everyone in the street had it. But I think they didn't all have it together. It went for 3 months, I say, roughly. But over a period of 3 months, I don't know anyone who didn't get it.
Okay.
Because you only had to inhale somewhere, that was it. Someone else would catch it. As soon as you breathed out. That was how it was caught.
Now, did you know any people who died?
Oh, hundreds. I was only young at the time, but you'd hear them say, Mr. So-and-so died. And even young kids, like 4 or 5 year old, and respect no one, and anyone 16 or 17. And people 50 and 60, you didn't have to be 50 or 60 to die with it. And there's nothing you could do about it.
Yeah, that sounds terrible.
It was terrible.
So Grace Schwebel's the third person that you'll hear. She grew up in Newtown in inner Sydney and became actually the first female, and in fact, I think the only female alderman of what was then called the Northcote South Sydney Council. She talks about face masks, inoculation injections, and cleanliness in the home to prevent disease spreading.
Now, around you were very young, but around 1919, 1920, there was a flu epidemic and a bubonic plague. I always thought it was the flu, but some people refer to it as the plague, so there might have been both.
Bubonic flu, they were calling.
Oh, right. Can you remember anything about that?
Vaguely, what I vaguely remember about that was we had to wear the masks and people were getting injections, and my father refused to allow us to have injection.
And do you know why?
For the simple reason, he said that there were people injected people and they got the flu and died anyhow. The odds weren't good enough. And he was very strict in our days about home cleanliness. People used to have what they call phenyl, or common name is called shoot dip. And we had to, the toilets and all those were always in the backyard. And we were always made to wash our hands before meals. We were kept clean. The home was vermin free. The drains outside the laundry and the wash house, some people call the wash house, there was always phenyl that was put in there every day for the drain. So he was very strict about that. He wouldn't allow us, and not one of us came down with it. Yet there were people down around the street. Lots of people did die from it, but it didn't affect our family.
So Henry Brown says that the death rate in nearby Erskineville was lower than in other parts of Sydney. And so in this bit of interview, he talks about his father's theory that the salting of the brick kilns, which proliferated in this area, there were numerous brick-making factories there, but his theory was that the salting of these brick kilns prevented the disease spreading.
What smells can you remember of Erskineville? What are the smells that you can remember from
well, the main thing was from the pottery over here in the brickyard. They used to salt the kilns at the pottery when they were putting the glaze on the earthenware pipes, water pipes. They'd salt the kilns and let a certain amount of chlorine in the air. But Dad always reckoned that was a good thing for the district, because when the pneumonic flu hit just after the First World War, I think it was about 1919, Erskineville had a lower death rate than practically every other suburb in Sydney. When people had to wear a mask, I had one for years, a little mask with a couple of loops on it, and if you were going out to the zoo or anywhere where there were a crowd of people, you had to wear one of them. It was compulsory. But Dad always reckoned it was the chlorine in the air from salting the kilns that more or less purified the air in Erskineville.
So Keith Mulhearn, he grew up in Newtown like Grace Schwebel, actually on the same street as it happens, and he talks about the flu hospitals, the emergency flu hospitals. And like other interviewees that you've heard so far, he does use the term flu interchangeably with the bubonic plague or the Black Death.
Can you remember the flu epidemic in about 1919?
Well, the war, 1919, when the war finished.
Yeah, what was that? Tell me, what can you remember about that?
Well, it was a flu, and it was really a serious flu. It was the Black Death. Up here at the Different opposite the university, at the start of City Road joins King Street.
Yes.
That was a Different it's now part of the university. Well, that was taken over. The people all sent home, and that became a hospital. And then the Palais Royal at the showground on the corner there, that became a hospital. And there was a lot of hospitals round about, and people were taken on, and they were dying left and right. Some of them may tell me that just take it in there, and when we put the bed, they just went, oh, well, he won't last long.
And was it like an influenza? Or was it
influenza? It was a very serious type of influenza, but there was a couple of types of it. One was the bubonic plague, they called one, and the soldiers brought it back. Something that started in the latter end of the war. And a lot of those died of that on the way and were sick, but they got back and had to have hospitalisation.
So there were two sort of epidemics. One was bubonic plague and one was flu.
At the same time, the flu and the bubonic plague. And a lot of people died. They went black. They discoloured normally, but discoloured much quicker. And also, the schools closed up, and we all had to wear a mask.
So the final person that you'll hear from tonight is Joyce Higgins. So Joyce lived in Woolloomooloo, and she talks about her brother's death from the flu, and also she talks about the inoculations and the lasting effect that they had on people.
You mentioned you had a 15-year-old brother who died. What year was that?
It was 18 or 19.
Well, what happened? What happened to your brother?
Well, you see, after the men came back from overseas with the war, they must have brought some germs back with them, with these rats, and we had the bubonic plague.
What was the impact on your family of your brother getting that?
They took him away. They thought he's got to go, so the horse and cart arrived.
Was he alive at that time?
Yeah, with about another 4 patients in it. And my mother went out after she got out of bed, saw him through the glass door. She wasn't allowed in, and that was it. She never saw him again.
People come through and fumigate houses and all that kind of
yes,
thing.
at that time everything was fumigated. Everybody had to be inoculated, and I can remember my mother arguing with the man that he wasn't going to put in my arm.
God.
But we had a cousin that worked at Grace Brothers, Broadway, and the doctor must have used the same needle 10 times. My cousin, to the day she died, had a mark up here the size of a florin because the needles were so thick. I mean, everything was so crude.
Yes.
Yeah, but they had no choice because it hit so suddenly.
Was this area isolated and quarantined?
Well, it wasn't just this area, it was all over.
All over what? The waterside areas?
All over Australia, I think. Oh, I think it was a national thing. I don't think it just belonged to us. I think all the suburbs had it.
So for me, these edited sections of interview are valuable because they give us an insight into how the flu affected people's daily lives 100 years ago, and also how families and communities coped. And they also tell us something about the nature of memory. So you might have noticed that for some of the people that were being interviewed, there was a conflation or a confusion between the terminology that was used to describe the disease. So they refer to it as the bubonic plague, the Black Death, and the pneumonic flu. These things get mixed up in people's memories, and the terms are often used interchangeably. It's interesting to speculate on this. So for one thing, the interview subjects were not medically trained, so they didn't necessarily know, the scientific names for these diseases. The bubonic plague, also commonly referred to as the Black Death, was present in Sydney in the early decades of the 20th century, was very much reported upon and was in people's living memory and indeed the collective memory. And interestingly, if you look at newspaper reports from the time, the flu was often referred to as the influenza plague. So that no doubt confused matters. But also, and I think you would have heard that in one of the people's recollections, I think it was Keith Mulhearn, when people were dying of the flu, they were said to turn black in the face, although I'm assured that it was more of a purple colour. Nonetheless, that visual imagery would have really implanted that idea of a Black Death. So historian Lucy Taxer noticed this too in her oral history work undertaken in the 1980s. She wrote an article about memories of the Spanish flu. And she suggests, drawing on the theory of Susan Sontag, that epidemic diseases have always been used as metaphors for social disorder. She remarks on the proximity of the outbreak of the influenza pandemic in Sydney in 1919 to the social dislocation and upheaval that was caused by World War I, and also the Great Strike of 1917, which had a large impact on the working population of inner Sydney. So just to wrap up, it's a very short analysis of the interviews, but I really just wanted you to hear those wonderful Australian voices. Oral history testimony can provide us an insight into the past that's not often found in the written record. Its value is not for accurate recall, but because it provides us a direct personal, it provides us sort of an insight into how everyday people remember the past, and it gives us a direct personal link back to that past. And so I think in the times that we're living through, hearing these voices and how they coped with the pandemic 100 years ago shows us that the things that we're experiencing today have been shared by others across time.
Thank you so much, Laila. That was fascinating, and I really just loved hearing those voices that you found in the collection. And so maybe we'll go. We've got lots of questions coming in, but there is one question, and it was the one that I was wondering too. Is how did you find these accounts? You know, are they transcribed? Did you have to sit and listen to anyone who was alive during that period and see if they happened to mention it? And are these oral histories available to people to listen to the whole recording?
So I can answer your questions in multiple ways. So most of the interviews you heard were from Sue Rosen. So Sue Rosen did those interviews, and she actually published a book which has excerpts in it. And so the book is called We Never Had a Hotbed of Crime, and it's basically excerpts from the oral history interviews. I think she interviewed around 70 people, and she happily sort of describes things in a thematic way. So she talks about the Depression. That's a big part of people's memories of the times that she was recording, but also there were some excerpts of oral histories of the Spanish flu and the people's memories. And so that to me sort of suggested that was a valuable collection to go into. And so I found, you know, looking at people's ages in the transcripts, and that gave me a pretty good guide about whose transcript to access. So to go to your other question, all of our interviews in our collection are fully transcribed, and so you can actually, they're in a Word document, so you can actually just do a simple find flu or Spanish or influenza and plague, anything like that helps you find what you need. And we do have an oral histories website, so it's called Sydney Oral Histories. We don't have all of our interviews published on that. We have around about a third of the interviews. However, we're always very happy if people want to make contact with us to supply the transcripts and the audio, as long as that's allowable on the permissions form that's being signed by the person being interviewed. And as I mentioned, the Sue Rosen's book is a good guide because it's actually got the names of the people who are interviewed. So that's sort of a really good way as an entry point into that collection.
Okay, so there is just a technical question here. Are those oral histories indexed by the names of those interviewed? So if someone knew a name, would they be able to go in and find them?
No, not publicly. They'd have to contact us. However, if they did a search in the Sydney Oral Histories website, and that person's interview happened to be up, then they could find it that way. But if they think they know somebody who's been interviewed, they can certainly contact the Sydney's history team, and we can do a search for that.
Okay, great. Thank you. A question, I guess there are two questions that seem different, but I think they're actually related. So one person wanted to know, is there any evidence that there was actually bubonic plague in Sydney at the same time as the Spanish flu? You know, is there a conflation going on which is evidence-based? And then the other question was about the limits of oral history. So I think those two questions really go together nicely, actually.
So that was one thing I was going to check. So basically the bubonic plague did pretty much break out every summer from 1900 up until the mid-20s. However, my understanding is that it wasn't necessarily every single year, and you know, there was a notifiable case, I think, in 1922 in Camperdown. That was we've got a lot of photographs in our collection that are documenting that. But my recollection of when I did look at this a few months ago is that it wasn't necessarily a flu, an outbreak at exactly the same time. But the thing is that it always, when the bubonic plague did break out in Sydney, it was always in January, which is exactly the same time that it broke out in the community. So I think, so it may not necessarily have been at exactly the same time, but I think there was a regularity to that disease breaking out, the bubonic plague breaking out, and it was certainly a lived experience for a lot of people, that particular infectious disease. And what was the other question about the limits of?
The limits of oral history. So, I mean, I guess so if, you know, technically people are talking about the plague and there was no plague, then the critic of oral history would say, so why are we interested in oral history at all? Because they don't get the facts right.
Yeah, well, I think what I flagged before is that the value of oral history testimony is that you hear people's voices and testimony who otherwise would not literally have a voice. And so I think it really does capture the everyday, certainly people's recall. I think it's really about the nature of memory, isn't it? So I think, even our memories, a lot of us here listening are historians, but we also are fallible with our memory. So I think, certainly it has a limit on what people remember. But I guess what I found really interesting is when you get lots of people misremembering the same thing, that's also kind of interesting about and exploring what memory means for us collectively.
Absolutely. And so I had a question about the how did these memories of the Spanish flu fit in with the trajectory of people's lives that they were recounting in the oral histories? And I guess what I'm really interested in is, was this a significant event for them? And just fitting in with what Peter Hobbins was saying at the beginning of the week, how there are so few memorials to the Spanish flu. And I think a lot of people have been really thinking about that. Did people see it as a big landmark in their lives, or was this just some small event that was way back then and then their lives became interesting after that?
Well, it's interesting because I think when you listen to some of the interview questions, there were, and not just in our collection, but also in other, so the Bicentennial Oral History collection, the historians who are asking the questions will ask them those things about do they remember the plague, do they remember the flu, do they remember the war? So there's all those sort of landmarks that people remember, but sometimes people don't remember those things. So I guess I've found 6 people talking in a quite coherent way out of 70. There were also children who were remembering, and it was interesting. I was talking to a neighbour of mine. He also watched the Australian Story, and he was saying how for him that sort of ideas about cleanliness weren't actually passed down, even though his grandparents would have lived through that flu. So it's sort of interesting about what gets transmitted. And I think there's also these sort of ideas when you have something like a traumatic experience, like a 4-year war, when there's these other events that are sort of on top of it. So the Spanish flu was very traumatic. It, killed a lot of people coming on top of the war. Is that there is also some sense of collective forgetting, in a sense. So people remember it as part of their sort of narrative, but it may not be the strongest part of their narrative.
Yeah, there were other things happening. And we're almost out of time, but I think there's another really interesting question here about relating this to the present and whether the City of Sydney or other entities have current oral history projects going on to try to create some historical records for future historians to use.
Well, that's an excellent question. I know that a lot of libraries and archives are collecting different types of materials to record this, because it is an important and sort of, life-changing moment in our histories that we're living through. We at the city are sort of looking at different ways that we can do that. It's not necessarily doubling up on other institutions in the way that they're collecting, but certainly I think oral history is one way that we could do that. It would be interesting because the people that were interviewed for Sue Rosen's project, they were sort of towards the end of their life remembering something that was at the beginning of their life, and I think you capture something quite different when you're recording the experience of someone living through something. So I think that would perhaps even be interesting to interview someone now and then actually capture their recollections down the track.
Yes, that's right. After all of that, other events of their lives had happened. And it was interesting that at least 2 or more of the people that you interviewed, they'd lost someone very important to them, a mother and a brother. And so those would really be life-changing events for anyone as a young child. So yeah, clearly that's going to be something that they remember and remains in the family storytelling and folklore and so on as well. Okay, well that's lovely, and that takes us right through to 7:30. So thank you so much, Laila. That was really fascinating, and I think we all very much enjoyed hearing those voices from the past, remembering the flu. And I hope that they will inspire some of the people out in this group and beyond to undertake their own oral history projects, whether that's trying to have a look at the oral histories that are already around about your region or your community, that whether there are any references to the flu there, or whether it is undertaking some oral history gathering yourselves. And so thank you to our audience. Thanks for those questions, which were terrific tonight. And I hope to see you back again tomorrow night when we'll have my colleague Kate Ariotti from the University of Newcastle talking about soldiers and quarantine as the soldiers returned from World War I into the Spanish flu-affected Australia. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Laila, and we'll hope to see you again tomorrow.
Wonderful. Thanks.